No one expected the royal procession to suddenly come to a standstill. The horses stayed perfectly still, the cameras never stopped recording, and the palace orchestra continued playing for several uneasy moments until Princess Anne made one subtle gesture. According to witnesses, she had noticed something that instantly caught her attention. Queen Camilla wearing an heirloom many believed was never intended to leave the royal vault. What followed, according to royal observers, became one of the most debated ceremonial moments in recent memory. Before we uncover what this could mean for the monarchy, be sure to subscribe so you never miss another update. State processions are carefully choreographed. Every movement is rehearsed, every appearance is reviewed, and every detail is measured against generations of royal tradition. That is precisely why what happened next appeared so unusual to those who claimed they witnessed it live. There was no public announcement, no obvious disturbance, and no dramatic interruption. Instead, something much stranger unfolded. The ceremony seemed to lose its momentum without explanation. According to interpretations later shared by royal commentators and palace watchers, Princess Anne had focused on something unexpected long before anyone else realized there was a reason for concern. Reports suggest she maintained her usual calm and composed appearance during the opening moments of the event. Then, almost too subtly to notice, everything appeared to shift. Those familiar with royal protocol often describe Princess Anne as someone who rarely displays emotion in public. Years of discipline, ceremony, and loyalty have earned her a reputation as the monarchy's quiet guardian, the royal who notices details others overlook and views tradition not as a choice, but as a duty. That is why later speculation centered less on anything she might have said and more on what she was believed to have seen. Queen Camilla appeared confident, composed, and fully prepared for the occasion. Yet attention soon turned toward one particular piece of jewelry she was wearing, an heirloom that, according to long-standing palace folklore and royal speculation, held a uniquely sensitive place within the royal collection. It has never been officially described as forbidden. However, it has often been whispered about as though it carried symbolic significance known only to those inside palace circles. Royal insiders and commentators later described the moment in very different ways. Some believed Princess Anne immediately recognized the importance of the heirloom. Others argued she simply noticed something unusual and quietly sought clarification. No verified public account has ever confirmed that any confrontation took place. But within the world of royal storytelling, silence often speaks louder than words. Then came the moment that sparked endless discussion. Staff members quietly began repositioning themselves. Messages appeared to move discreetly between officials. The schedule seemed to hesitate. Observers later claimed subtle procedural adjustments unfolded almost immediately, small enough that most viewers missed them, yet unusual enough for experienced royal correspondents to take notice. The orchestra continued for a short time. Palace personnel remained composed. Yet somehow, the smooth rhythm of the procession no longer felt uninterrupted. The pause itself lasted only a few brief moments. But within an institution built on certainty and tradition, even the smallest hesitation can become deeply symbolic. People watching from outside could not understand what had changed. Some assumed there had been a security concern. Others believed it was simply a timing issue. A few immediately suspected something much more significant had unfolded behind the scenes. Soon, social media filled with slowed-down footage, side-by-side comparisons, and countless theories. Royal commentators revisited old discussions about ceremonial customs, private traditions, and the hidden meanings attached to historic heirlooms. Throughout it all, Queen Camilla reportedly remained calm and composed. Ironically, that detail only fueled even greater speculation. If there had truly been concern surrounding the heirloom, many wondered, why was there no visible reaction? Why continue the ceremony? Why not quietly replace the piece afterward? The absence of any official explanation created exactly the kind of mystery that royal stories have always thrived upon. Within hours, unofficial explanations began spreading rapidly. Royal observers revisited long-standing discussions about inherited treasures, symbolic privileges, and the unwritten customs believed to exist alongside official protocol. Some dismissed the entire situation as an exaggerated interpretation of a perfectly ordinary ceremony. Others remained convinced that something meaningful had taken place behind the scenes. Yet one detail continued returning to the center of every discussion. Not the pause. Not the whispers. Not even Princess Anne herself. The heirloom. Because if the observers were correct, if the procession had truly slowed because of a single royal jewel, then the story was no longer about ceremony alone. The real mystery became something far more significant. Why did that heirloom matter so much? The royal collection contains thousands of historic pieces. Yet royal historians have often suggested that a select few were never viewed as ordinary jewelry. Instead, they became symbols of authority, remembrance, and traditions that were rarely written down but deeply respected. That was the thread many people began pulling the moment questions surfaced about the interrupted procession. Among royal customs, both officially documented and quietly preserved, there has always been a difference between ownership and permission. To the public, a royal heirloom is simply an object passed down through generations. Inside palace tradition, however, certain pieces have long been viewed differently. They are not merely valuable possessions. They are symbols, silent reminders of continuity. According to interpretations that spread quickly after the ceremony, the piece Queen Camilla was believed to be wearing belonged to that very small and highly symbolic group. No official record has ever labeled any royal jewel as forbidden. That distinction is important. However, many royal commentators have argued that the monarchy functions on two separate layers: formal rules recorded in protocol and quieter customs preserved through tradition, memory, and expectation. It is within those unwritten traditions that stories like this continue to survive. Long-standing commentary has often suggested that certain heirlooms become connected not to individuals, but to specific moments in royal history. A coronation, a change of generations, a private understanding, an agreement that may never have been announced publicly but remained well understood by those raised inside the institution. Over time, those traditions gather emotional weight. Royal historians frequently point out how objects gradually become linked to historic figures. A necklace becomes forever associated with a queen's final years. A brooch comes to represent national mourning. A tiara appears only during carefully selected state occasions. Eventually, the object no longer belongs to the person wearing it. Instead, it belongs to the story surrounding it. That is exactly why speculation spread so quickly. Because if the heirloom at the center of this moment truly carried even a portion of the symbolic importance being discussed, then this was never simply about appearance. It became about timing, context, meaning. Some palace observers argued there was probably nothing unusual at all. Perhaps permission had been quietly granted behind closed doors, and outside audiences were reading too much into ordinary protocol. Others suggested a far more uncomfortable possibility: that invisible expectations still existed inside the institution, and someone had unknowingly stepped into symbolic territory whose importance was understood only by those closest to the monarchy. Then older stories began resurfacing. Long-forgotten whispers returned about how previous generations supposedly handled royal treasures connected to succession and legacy. Some accounts claimed certain heirlooms had traditionally been associated with specific branches of the royal family or reserved for occasions carrying deep constitutional symbolism. None of those stories have ever been publicly verified. Yet they continued spreading because, within the world of monarchy, they sounded believable enough to capture public imagination. Princess Anne's name soon returned to the center of the discussion, not because she held authority over the royal collection, but because many observers have long viewed her as one of the strongest defenders of royal tradition. If she had truly reacted, people wondered, perhaps it wasn't the jewel itself that concerned her. Perhaps it was what wearing it represented. That single possibility changed the entire conversation. The interrupted procession was no longer seen simply as an unexpected delay. In the minds of many, it had become a story about legacy. Who protects tradition? Who interprets it? And who decides when an old custom still deserves to be respected? Royal history has repeatedly shown that objects rarely become controversial on their own. Their importance comes from the meaning attached to them, the people who preserve that meaning, and occasionally, those who unintentionally challenge it. If those long-discussed traditions truly existed, then only two possibilities remained. Either someone had approved what many believed impossible, or someone had overlooked the unwritten expectations entirely. Royal ceremonies are organized with remarkable precision. Interruptions are extremely uncommon unless someone believes the institution itself could be affected. That idea quickly gained momentum once attention shifted away from the heirloom and toward the unexplained pause that surrounded it. State events do not simply lose direction without reason. Every stage is carefully timed, reviewed, authorized, and protected through procedures designed to prevent uncertainty from becoming visible. which meant that if something had truly changed in the middle of the procession, as many observers later claimed, the most important part of the story may never have been seen by the public at all. According to interpretations shared afterward, the interruption did not arrive through a loud command or dramatic confrontation. It unfolded the way institutional decisions often do. Quietly. Indirectly. Without explanation. Royal commentators later described an unusual pattern among palace staff. Officials appeared to exchange discreet messages. Positions shifted. Vehicles slowed slightly. Brief conversations replaced routine movement. None of these observations were officially confirmed. Yet together they created the impression that something administrative, rather than ceremonial, had briefly taken priority. Inside institutions built upon continuity, those administrative moments often reveal far more than public speeches ever can. What fascinated many observers was not the speed with which people moved. It was the complete absence of visible confusion. That detail became central to later speculation. Confusion suggests surprise. Coordination suggests recognition. Some believed the pause indicated that senior officials immediately understood the symbolic sensitivity surrounding the heirloom once attention had been drawn to it. Others proposed a completely different explanation. Perhaps palace staff were simply trying to determine whether any protocol issue existed at all. From that perspective, the pause was not an act of enforcement. It was a moment of uncertainty. Then another question quietly emerged. Who had approved the appearance in the first place? If the heirloom carried no restrictions whatsoever, then nothing unusual had happened and the discussion should have ended there. But if unwritten customs really surrounded certain ceremonial pieces, then approval itself suddenly became part of the mystery. Soon, competing explanations began circulating. One theory claimed full authorization had always existed and the public had misunderstood royal tradition. Another suggested permission had simply been assumed rather than formally confirmed. A third, and by far the most dramatic, imagined that different parts of the institution interpreted the same customs differently, creating a quiet clash between modernization and preservation. That possibility once again brought Princess and back into the spotlight. Not because anyone suggested she controlled access to royal heirlooms, but because of what she has come to represent in public imagination. Over the years, and has earned a reputation, fairly or unfairly, as the member of the royal family most closely associated with discipline, continuity, and institutional memory. The royal who notices details others overlook. The figure many imagine stepping forward whenever symbolism begins drifting into uncertainty. As that narrative spread, her reported gesture during the procession took on an entirely different meaning. It was no longer viewed simply as personal concern. For some, it became the image of someone protecting traditions invisible to the outside world. For others, it represented an institution wrestling with the challenge of defining itself in a changing era. Meanwhile, the palace remained completely silent.
No clarification. No correction.
No direct response. And inside royal life, silence rarely ends speculation. More often, it makes it grow. Once people began believing they had witnessed a disagreement that was never meant to be seen, every pause appeared deliberate. Every adjustment seemed carefully planned. Every unanswered question felt like evidence that something larger existed beneath the surface. Yet the brief interruption was only the visible part of a much older debate. Royal disagreements rarely arrive through raised voices or public arguments. More often, they emerge through schedules, permissions, ceremonial arrangements, and symbolic objects. By the time public discussion reached that point, attention had already shifted far beyond whether a procession had briefly paused or whether a particular heirloom had unexpectedly appeared. The conversation had evolved into something much deeper. Not a conflict between individuals. A conflict between ideas. Because beneath nearly every modern royal controversy lies the same quiet question. What should remain unchanged? And what should evolve? For decades, two different visions of the monarchy have existed side by side. One believes the institution survives by adapting to modern expectations. Traditions become more flexible, symbolism changes with time, and relevance comes through evolution. The other believes survival depends upon preserving clear boundaries. Customs continue only when their meaning remains protected, even if those traditions appear outdated to the outside world. Neither philosophy openly challenges the other. But from time to time, they inevitably collide. Many commentators believe that possibility formed the hidden current beneath the entire heirloom discussion. As they revisited the procession, Princess and increasingly came to represent something larger than herself. She was no longer viewed as someone reacting emotionally. Instead, she became, in public imagination, the embodiment of an older institutional mindset. For years, many have seen and as someone who believes personal preference should always come second to inherited responsibility. Within that view, the role matters more than the individual. Ceremony matters because symbolism matters. And symbolism matters because it reinforces public confidence that the institution still understands its own identity. Seen from that perspective, even the smallest decisions can carry enormous significance. A title granted too easily. A tradition altered too quickly. An heirloom appearing at an unexpected moment. Each becomes far greater than the action itself. At the same time, others interpreted the situation very differently. They argued that no institution can remain frozen forever. Traditions naturally evolve. Expectations change. And those inside the monarchy inevitably reinterpret old customs through the realities of a new generation. Within that interpretation, Queen Camilla appeared less like someone challenging tradition and more like someone approaching it from a different perspective. Not rejecting royal customs. Simply understanding them differently. Supporters of that viewpoint argued that ceremonial decisions today are increasingly influenced by practicality, accessibility, and contemporary expectations rather than preserving symbolic distinctions most members of the public may never even recognize. That was where the quiet tension seemed to deepen. Because if one side views adaptation as the key to survival while the other sees adaptation as the gradual erosion of tradition, then the exact same decision can be interpreted in completely opposite ways. What one person celebrates as modernization, another sees as loss. Suddenly, the discussion surrounding the heirloom was no longer centered on ownership or protocol. It had entered symbolic territory. If the appearance had been intentional, some viewed it as confidence in a monarchy embracing change. If it had been overlooked, others saw it as evidence that old boundaries were slowly becoming harder to define. Neither explanation required a public confrontation. And perhaps that was exactly what made the story so compelling. There were no raised voices. No official disagreements. Only silence. Within that silence, people supplied their own interpretations. The halted procession became a symbol. The heirloom became a question. Princess and became, in public imagination, the guardian of continuity. Queen Camilla became, fairly or unfairly, a symbol of a monarchy navigating an uncertain future. Not opponents. Not rivals. Simply two figures representing different instincts within the same institution. But once people began viewing the moment through that lens, another question naturally followed. If this reflected something deeper than a simple ceremonial pause, would someone eventually be forced to respond? Attention soon shifted away from the procession itself and toward who, if anyone, might respond next. The palace offered no immediate denial, and that silence quickly became the center of the story. At first, the lack of an explanation seemed completely routine. Royal households have never been known for responding to every rumor, every theory, or every interpretation created by commentators searching for hidden meaning. For generations, silence has been one of the monarchy's most reliable tools. It preserves dignity. It avoids unnecessary controversy. And more often than not, it allows public attention to move elsewhere. This time, however, attention refused to fade. Instead, it intensified. Within hours, discussion surrounding the interrupted procession expanded beyond those directly involved and evolved into something much broader and far more difficult to contain. The original question, whether Princess and had reacted to a ceremonial concern, began splitting into dozens of new questions. Why had the procession slowed? Why did officials appear to adjust their movements? Why had no clarification been issued afterward? And perhaps most importantly, if nothing unusual had happened, why did so many observers feel that something clearly had? That uncertainty created a space for speculation. And within royal life, empty space rarely remains empty for long. Royal commentators, newspaper columnists, and longtime palace observers soon offered dramatically different interpretations. Some urged restraint, arguing that the entire discussion reflected public fascination with symbolism rather than any genuine disagreement. From that perspective, An ordinary procedural pause had simply been transformed into an extraordinary story because the monarchy naturally invites interpretation. Others were far less convinced. Anonymous remarks reportedly linked to palace circles, impossible to verify, yet impossible to ignore, began appearing in fragments. References to tradition. Suggestions of internal discussions. Vague comments about ceremonial expectations. Nothing specific. Nothing officially confirmed. Yet enough to persuade many people that conversations may indeed have taken place behind closed doors. For much of the public, that possibility alone was enough. Online debate accelerated almost immediately. One theory argued the pause had been entirely unrelated, while the heirloom story only emerged afterward through coincidence. Another insisted the issue had never been the jewel itself, but the symbolism attached to its appearance. Others proposed an even broader explanation. They believed the moment reflected an ongoing struggle over identity within a monarchy adapting to a changing world. As more theories emerged, one thing became increasingly clear. People were no longer discussing jewelry. They were discussing authority. Who defines meaning within a royal institution? Who decides when tradition evolves? Who has the right to interpret customs that have never been formally written down? Those questions carried enormous emotional significance because they reached beyond ceremony. They touched symbolic legitimacy. Not legal authority, but the public belief that someone still protects the institution's invisible boundaries. Meanwhile, palace officials maintained their familiar restraint. Requests for further explanation reportedly produced no major clarification. No public correction. No dramatic rejection of the speculation. Only the quiet continuation of royal business. That silence carried consequences. Because whenever institutions choose not to explain themselves, audiences inevitably begin creating explanations of their own. Gradually, the narrative shifted once again. Princess and stopped being viewed simply as an individual. She became associated with preservation. Queen Camilla was no longer discussed merely as a participant. She became associated with change. The heirloom itself was no longer seen simply as a valuable object. It became associated with permission. Every unanswered question added another layer of meaning. Every silence encouraged another interpretation. By that stage, public expectations had changed completely. People were no longer asking what had happened during the procession. Because if no official explanation ever arrived, then public interpretation itself would become the lasting story. And whatever conclusion emerged from that process could prove far more influential than the original rumor ever was. What happened afterward had very little to do with jewelry and much more to do with control. Within royal life, ownership and permission have never been viewed as the same thing. That realization slowly began changing the way many people interpreted everything that had happened during the procession. The brief pause no longer appeared to be an isolated interruption. The unanswered questions no longer seemed accidental. Even the growing discussion about symbolism began moving towards something far deeper. The difference between possessing something and representing something. Inside institutions shaped by centuries of history, those two ideas are rarely treated equally. Public imagination often assumes royal heirlooms function like ordinary family inheritances. An object exists. Someone inherits it. The story ends there. But royal tradition has always followed a far more complicated emotional logic. Certain objects become connected to roles rather than individuals. To moments rather than ownership. To responsibility rather than possession. That distinction matters not because of legal documents or official authority, but because symbols survive differently than property ever can. According to interpretations frequently discussed by royal observers, ceremonial traditions often resemble stewardship more than ownership. The person wearing an heirloom is not necessarily viewed as its permanent owner. Instead, they become a temporary guardian of a meaning created long before they arrived, and one that will continue long after they are gone. Whether that reflects actual palace practice or simply public mythology gradually became less important. People believed it. And belief is often what gives institutions their lasting influence. That is why conversations surrounding the heirloom refuse to disappear. If an object carries symbolic stewardship, then simply appearing with it can communicate messages no official statement ever needs to say aloud. Continuity. Recognition. Transition. Approval. Or, during moments of uncertainty, something many interpret as challenge. Small decisions begin carrying enormous significance. Because institutions quietly teach people to search for meaning. That expectation creates its own invisible pressure. Every appearance is examined for intention. Every absence invites questions. Every adjustment becomes open to interpretation. Once those expectations exist, no institution retains complete control over how its actions are understood. That reality also changed the way many people viewed the palace's earlier silence. Perhaps there had never been any disagreement at all. Perhaps there had simply been awareness. An awareness that publicly explaining symbolic decisions often creates even greater controversy than quietly allowing them to remain unexplained. Still, another possibility continued lingering beneath the surface. What if people were never reacting to the heirloom itself? What if they were reacting to what they believed the heirloom represented? By now, the discussion had expanded far beyond ceremony. Questions emerged about image. Questions emerged about influence. Questions emerged about succession, not in the constitutional sense, but in the emotional sense. Who represents continuity? Who shapes public perception of the monarchy's future? Who becomes associated with preserving tradition? And who becomes associated with redefining it? Those are difficult questions for any historic institution because they rarely produce simple answers. Gradually, the emotional weight of the story became heavier. A paused procession had become a conversation about identity. A single heirloom had become a conversation about stewardship. Silence itself had become a conversation about authority. People who initially dismissed the moment as ordinary now found themselves debating whether royal customs should remain untouched or openly evolve. Others questioned whether those boundaries had ever truly existed in the way people imagined. Perhaps the real tension had never been between tradition and change. Perhaps it had always been about something much more fundamental. Who has the authority to define what those words actually mean? Once that question entered public discussion, the procession itself almost faded into the background. By this stage, the halted procession had grown into something far greater than a single ceremonial moment. There had been no dramatic announcement. No confrontation captured on camera. No official statement confirming that anything unusual had taken place. Yet many observers remained convinced that something had quietly changed. That was what made the entire story so unusual. After days of speculation, competing theories, and endless attempts to interpret a moment the palace never officially explained, the monarchy responded in the way it so often has throughout history. It simply carried on. No public clarification arrived to settle the debate. No ceremonial update appeared to read. No visible disagreement emerged to confirm that anything extraordinary had happened. And still, for many watching closely, the atmosphere somehow felt different. Not dramatically. Subtly. That difference mattered because institutions rarely announce adjustment while it is taking place. Instead, they absorb attention, maintain composure, and continue forward as though nothing ever required explanation. In the weeks that followed, royal observers began attaching significance to details that previously would have gone unnoticed. Public appearances received closer examination. Ceremonial decisions attracted greater attention. Timing. Positioning. Presentation. Moments once dismissed as routine suddenly became subjects of careful interpretation. Not because anyone had confirmed a change, but because once people believe they have glimpsed the inner workings of an institution, they begin searching for signs everywhere. Some believed they noticed greater caution in future appearances. Others argued audiences had simply become more aware, projecting deeper meaning onto ordinary royal events. Either way, the conversation gradually evolved. The earlier excitement began fading. Theories that once sounded explosive became more measured. Questions became less confrontational and more reflective. People stopped asking whether someone had broken an unwritten rule. Instead, they began wondering whether that rule had ever truly existed in the way they imagined. Ironically, that shift reduced the controversy while making the discussion far more interesting. Attention moved away from conflict and toward continuity. Many royal commentators returned to a familiar observation. Historic institutions rarely survive by winning every public argument. They survive by refusing to let individual controversies define them. Whatever people believed had occurred during the procession, the monarchy itself appeared unwilling to validate the growing drama surrounding it. Royal engagements continued. Ceremonial appearances continued. Official schedules continued. That uninterrupted rhythm became meaningful in its own right. To some, it reflected confidence. To others, discipline. And to many, it served as a quiet reminder that monarchy is designed to outlast moments of public interpretation. At the heart of the discussion remained the same unresolved tension. Modern audiences increasingly expect institutions to explain themselves. Older traditions often expect institutions to endure without explanation. Perhaps that balance was what many people believed they had witnessed. Not stricter protocol. Not hidden consequences. But a renewed awareness of the delicate line between transparency and mystery. Public life depends upon visibility. Royal life has long depended upon symbolism. Perhaps that is why the silence never completely disappeared. Explanations satisfy curiosity.
Ambiguity preserves tradition.
As time passed, discussion surrounding the heirloom slowly lost its urgency. New events captured public attention. Commentary softened. Speculation gradually faded. Yet one impression remained. Not certainty. Not proof. Only the lingering feeling that one brief interruption had momentarily revealed just how much invisible structure exists beneath ceremonies most people consider routine. No speeches followed. No declarations were issued. No one stepped forward to define what should ultimately be remembered. Perhaps that was the point all along. The monarchy never answered the question. It simply continued, leaving everyone else to decide for themselves what the silence truly meant. Then the conversation gradually moved beyond the procession itself. People were no longer focused on what had happened during those few unusual moments. Instead, they wanted to understand what the incident might reveal about the future of the monarchy. The palace never rushed to deny the speculation. It never publicly confirmed it either. That silence became part of the story. At first, many viewed the lack of an explanation as completely normal. Royal households rarely respond to every rumor or every interpretation circulating online. For generations, silence has been one of the institution's most effective strategies. It avoids unnecessary, it protects dignity. And in most situations, it allows public curiosity to fade naturally. This time, however, curiosity only grew stronger. As hours turned into days, discussion expanded far beyond the individuals involved. The original question surrounding Princess and slowly transformed into something much broader. Why had the procession appeared to pause? Why had officials seemed to adjust their movements? Why had no one offered an explanation afterward? And perhaps most importantly, if nothing unusual had happened, why were so many people convinced that something had? That uncertainty opened the door to countless interpretations. Within royal history, unanswered questions rarely remain unanswered for long. Observers, commentators, and longtime royal writers began offering remarkably different perspectives. Some argued that the public had simply projected unnecessary drama onto an ordinary ceremonial moment. In their view, the monarchy naturally attracts symbolism, causing even routine events to appear more significant than they truly are. Others disagreed. Reports attributed to unnamed palace sources, never officially confirmed, began circulating through articles and commentary. References to royal tradition. Suggestions of quiet internal discussions. Hints about ceremonial expectations. None of the claims could be independently verified. Yet together they encouraged many people to believe that conversations had indeed taken place behind closed doors. That alone was enough to fuel public imagination. Online discussions intensified almost immediately. Some believed the procession's pause had been completely unrelated, while the heirloom story developed afterward through coincidence. Others insisted the jewel itself had never been the issue. Its symbolic meaning was. A growing number of observers proposed something even larger. Perhaps the moment reflected an ongoing balance between preserving centuries-old customs and adapting to a changing modern monarchy. As more interpretations emerged, one reality became increasingly obvious. The conversation had stopped being about jewelry. It had become about authority. Who determines the meaning behind royal tradition? Who decides when customs should evolve? Who interprets expectations that have never been formally written into official protocol? Those questions carried emotional significance because they touched something far deeper than ceremony. They touched trust. Not legal authority, but symbolic authority. The public belief that someone continues protecting the institution's invisible foundations. Meanwhile, palace officials remained consistent. No dramatic statement. No public correction. No effort to directly challenge the speculation. Only the quiet continuation of royal duties. That silence produced its own consequences. When institutions choose not to explain themselves, people naturally begin creating explanations of their own. Gradually, public perception shifted once again. Princess and became associated with preserving tradition. Queen Camilla increasingly became associated with change. The heirloom itself came to represent permission rather than possession. Every unanswered question invited another interpretation. Every quiet moment encouraged another theory. Eventually, people stopped asking what had happened during the procession. Instead, they wanted to know whether anyone inside the institution would ever explain what the moment truly represented. Because if no official explanation ever arrived, public interpretation itself would become the last, and in many ways, that narrative could ultimately prove far more influential than the original rumor that started it all. But what followed next had even less to do with a single heirloom and far more to do with perception. Inside the monarchy, possession and symbolism have rarely meant the same thing. That realization slowly reshaped how many people interpreted everything that had happened before. The halted procession no longer seemed like an isolated moment. The unanswered questions no longer appeared accidental. Even the debate surrounding tradition began moving towards something much deeper: the distinction between owning something and representing something. Within institutions built upon history, those two ideas are rarely viewed as identical. To the public, royal heirlooms often appear to function like ordinary family inheritances. Someone receives a treasured object. The story ends there. But royal tradition has always carried a different logic. Certain objects become connected not simply to individuals, but to roles. Not merely to ownership, but to responsibility. Not only to history, but to identity. That difference matters because symbols often survive far longer than the people connected to them. According to interpretations frequently discussed by royal observers, ceremonial traditions sometimes resemble stewardship rather than possession. The individual wearing an heirloom is seen less as its owner and more as its temporary guardian. Someone entrusted with preserving a meaning created long before their time and expected to continue long after they are gone. Whether that reflects official palace practice or simply public belief eventually became almost irrelevant. People accepted the idea. And institutions often draw much of their strength from belief itself. That explains why discussions surrounding the heirloom refuse to disappear. If an object carries symbolic importance, simply appearing with it can communicate messages no public statement ever needs to express. Continuity. Recognition. Transition. Approval. Or, during uncertain moments, something many interpret as challenge. Small ceremonial choices suddenly begin carrying extraordinary significance. Because institutions quietly encourage people to search for meaning beneath appearances. Once that expectation exists, every public appearance invites interpretation. Every absence raises questions. Every adjustment becomes worthy of analysis. And eventually, no institution retains complete control over how its actions are understood. That emotional reality also transformed the meaning of the palace's silence. Perhaps there had never been a disagreement. Perhaps there had only been caution. A recognition that publicly explaining symbolic decisions often creates greater controversy than quietly allowing them to remain open to interpretation. Yet another possibility continued lingering. What if people had never truly been reacting to the heirloom itself? What if they had been reacting to everything they believed it represented? By now, the conversation had moved far beyond ceremonial protocol. Questions emerged about public image. Questions emerged about influence. Questions emerged about succession, not in a constitutional sense, but in an emotional one. Who represents continuity? Who shapes the future image of the monarchy? Who becomes associated with preserving its traditions? And who becomes associated with redefining them? Those questions rarely produce simple answers. Gradually, the emotional weight surrounding the story became heavier. A paused procession had evolved into a discussion about identity. A single heirloom had become a discussion about stewardship. Silence itself had become a discussion about authority. People who initially dismissed the entire incident as routine now found themselves debating whether royal customs should remain untouched or adapt with changing times. Others questioned whether those invisible boundaries had ever truly existed at all. Perhaps the deeper issue had never been tradition versus change. Perhaps it had always been about something much more fundamental. Who ultimately decides what those words actually mean? Once that question entered public imagination, the procession itself almost became secondary. What remained was a broader conversation, one not about jewelry or ceremony, but about the future direction of an institution built upon both history and symbolism. In the end, the procession itself slowly faded into the background. No dramatic announcement was ever made. No televised confrontation followed. No official statement arrived to settle the speculation once and for all. Yet many people continued believing that something meaningful had taken place. That was perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire story. After countless theories, endless commentary, and repeated attempts to explain a moment the palace never officially addressed, the monarchy responded in the way it has so often throughout history. It simply moved forward. Royal engagements continued. Public appearances continued. Ceremonial schedules remained unchanged. Life inside the institution appeared to carry on exactly as before. For some observers, that demonstrated confidence. For others, it reflected discipline. And for many, it served as a reminder that the monarchy has always been designed to outlast moments of uncertainty. As weeks passed, the intensity surrounding the heirloom gradually began to fade. New events captured headlines. Fresh discussions replaced older debates. The urgency slowly disappeared. Yet one impression continued lingering in public memory. Not certainty. Not proof. Simply the feeling that one brief pause had momentarily revealed how much unseen structure exists beneath ceremonies that usually appear effortless. No speeches were delivered to explain it. No formal declarations attempted to redefine it. No single individual stepped forward to tell the public what they should believe. Perhaps that silence was the message itself. The monarchy never answered every question. Instead, it continued doing what it has always done, moving forward while allowing interpretation to remain in the hands of those watching. Over time, attention shifted away from conflict and towards something much quieter. Continuity. Royal institutions rarely survive because they win every public debate. They endure because they refuse to allow individual moments to define them. Whether people believe the procession had truly been interrupted for symbolic reasons, or whether they viewed the entire episode as public overanalysis, one fact remained unchanged. The institution itself never altered its course. That quiet consistency became part of the story. Some viewed it as strength. Others viewed it as tradition. Still others saw it as a deliberate reminder that monarchy has always relied as much on mystery as it has on ceremony. Modern audiences often expect immediate explanations. Historic institutions have frequently preferred patience over clarification. Perhaps that balance was what fascinated people most. Not hidden punishments. Not secret consequences. Simply the realization that public life demands transparency while royal life has long depended upon symbolism. Eventually, discussions surrounding the heirloom softened. Speculation became less dramatic. Questions became more reflective. People stopped asking whether someone had violated an unwritten custom. Instead, they began asking why the moment had felt so important in the first place. They assigned stories to them. And this story ultimately became much larger than a single procession. Not because anyone proved what happened. Not because history officially recorded it as a turning point. But because one brief pause encouraged millions to think differently about continuity, symbolism, and the invisible traditions that continue shaping one of the world's oldest institutions. In the end, people remembered Princess Anne not because of something she reportedly said. They remembered Queen Camilla not because she responded publicly. They remembered the pause. For some, that pause represented protection. For others, adaptation. For many, it symbolized the delicate balance between preserving tradition and embracing change. Perhaps that is why no definitive answer ever emerged. Certainty often brings stories to an end. Mystery allows them to endure. The procession moved on. Royal schedules resumed. Public attention gradually turned elsewhere. Yet that brief moment remained suspended in memory, not as evidence, not as confirmation, but as a reminder that institutions are often revealed most clearly not through their grand ceremonies, but through their quietest moments. No official record may ever explain exactly what people believe they witnessed. No archive may fully capture the emotions attached to that day. But perhaps legacy has never depended upon absolute certainty. Perhaps it has always depended upon what people choose to remember. Sometimes the most unforgettable royal moments are not the speeches delivered before the cameras. They are the brief silences that leave the world asking questions long after the ceremony has ended. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.